Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Bob Melk. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at Monster. And I want to thank everybody for being a part of this customer event today. These are pretty remarkable times, as we all know. And as leaders within our organizations, we're at the forefront of change in response to COVID and the ongoing new normal evolution. Today's session is going to highlight the state of the market with a special focus on jobs, candidates, and also Monster's response during the pandemic. So I am excited that we have an open concept agenda that's going to focus less on specific topics, but more generally on the ability for us at Monster to share information that we hope is relevant to all of you right now. I'm sure you've been devouring a lot of stats and details over the past few weeks. I know that I've been doing this every day. I would like to introduce Scott Blumsack. He's our SVP of Strategy here at Monster, and he will share some relevant data on the jobs market that I hope you'll find interesting. We will, as you can see, have an opportunity for Q&A, and I want to encourage everyone to submit your questions throughout this presentation, meaning at any moment, into the chat box. I have one of our colleagues, Meg Goulet, is online and here to help Scott and I in the background to ensure that we are taking your questions. We'll try to address a few of them on the slides that are specific to the question if we can get to them fast enough. If not, we'll add them as many as we can to the Q&A on the back end of today's presentation, okay? So I look forward to hearing from all of you. I want this to be as interactive as it can be so that we can ensure we're adding as much value to the conversation as is possible. So on that note, as I said, I want to hand it over to Scott Blumsack, SVP of Strategy for Monster. Scotty, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate that. And thanks to everybody who's joined the discussion today. As Bob mentioned, I'm Scott Blumsack. I lead corporate strategy for Monster. And really my hope for today is, as Bob has mentioned, we're all seeing lots of different information come out from a wide variety of different sources. My goal here isn't to necessarily tell you anything brand new that you haven't heard before, or quite frankly, to provide an answer around the question of when this is all going to dissipate and we will return to a state of normalcy. If I could do that, I don't think I'd be here right now. But really my hope is to try and synthesize a lot of the information that's out there, maybe provide a framework to help frame up some of the discussions we can have during this session, but also how you can start to think about things more broadly and how they apply to your organizations. And finally, just share kind of some perspectives that we have here at Monster through the lens of some of the things that we're seeing kind of evolve real time. So I'll start with, this certainly, won't be brand new to anybody, but sort of the classic hockey stick of what we've seen in terms of overall US cases, confirmed cases of COVID-19. I think just a couple points to emphasize here. The first is, obviously given the difficulty with sort of widespread testing, et cetera, and the prevalence of a large degree of asymptomatic cases, this drastically understates obviously the true impact that COVID has had for certain. But really, I think the thing to emphasize is just the pace at which these cases have increased. I think if you're somebody like me, I have two young children at home, and if you were to tell me that this has only been going on for the past 5 or 6 weeks, I would be convinced that this has been going on for 6 months. And so I think, as you'll see as a constant theme throughout a lot of this material, just the pace by which we've seen the impact of COVID has been, I think, one of the things that has differentiated this pandemic from a lot of the other kind of similar sorts of crises that we've experienced over time. The other thing to call out is, actually, I just got a ping right before this that we've officially crossed the 1 million barrier in terms of cases in the US, confirmed cases anyway. That's roughly out of a total of about 3 million globally. So it gives you some perspective at the impact that the US has had vis-a-vis COVID relative to the rest of the world. As most of us obviously are experiencing, businesses have reacted swiftly to the rise in COVID cases in terms of how they've actually started to manage their businesses differently. And there's I think a couple of different buckets. As we're all experiencing, I'm sure the sort of the shift to remote work and the dramatic way that has sort of changed how we interact with each other and get our jobs done has been truly remarkable around how swift that change has taken place. Obviously, in addition to that, there's been really the widespread cancellation around any sort of voluntary corporate travel. And a lot of the preparedness plans that I think a lot of our organizations have developed with sort of the assumption that they would hopefully just sit on a shelf. We've all had to sort of dust those off and actually implement those in a way that we couldn't have even imagined as we were creating them. And then obviously the other piece has been sort of the financial element of things. I don't think really any business has been untouched in terms of the need to refocus on the cost side of the equation, whether it's been through actions like delaying investments or looking for opportunities to preserve liquidity, just given everything that's going on. And in many cases, that's manifested itself in terms of either furloughs or layoffs or other impacts to the broader workforce. And we're obviously seeing this impact from a macro perspective in a way that is, as I mentioned earlier, with all of these impacts, is completely unprecedented. So if, just to pick a few metrics here, if you look at the stock market, we all know the significant pain that's been experienced from a stock market decline perspective. We have seen some rebound, but I mean, the thing that's amazing about this is typically, a bear market is characterized as a 20% decrease from the high, and a bull market is characterized as a 20% increase from the low. We've seen both of those things happen in the past few weeks, which is just really incredible to sort of take a step back and think about. Obviously, just the grinding halt by which all economic activity has stopped has led to a significant decrease in the expectations around GDP, both certainly for Q2, but also obviously for the balance of the year. So I think a lot of the forecasts are changing more frequently than most weather forecasters forecast the weather. But generally speaking, most are pegging a Q2 macroeconomic decline in the US to be between 10 and 20%, and mid to upper single digits for the full year. So serious, obviously, implications of the slowing economic situation. And obviously, the unemployment rate is sort of the third key metric that we've seen just unprecedented impact to. So thus far in the US, about 26 million people have lost their jobs so far. We'll see what that translates to from an actual unemployment rate once we get the latest data for April and March. Obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, even just those first couple of weeks, saw an increase of a full percentage point in the unemployment rate. I think the expectations are it will likely be somewhere between probably 15 to low 20% of unemployment for the U.S. I do know we have some colleagues who are joining us and some customers from Canada, and obviously that impact has actually been even more significant than what we've seen in the U.S. With estimates ranging from between 5 and 7 million jobs lost in Canada, which roughly translates to upwards of a potentially 30% unemployment rate in Canada. And just to put that in perspective, if those numbers were to hold, that basically is all the job creation that's happened in Canada since 1986. So again, just the level of impact has been truly unprecedented. And you know, going with just the level, again, just the pace by which this impact has been felt has been exceedingly rapid, and again, to overuse the term, just unprecedented. So if we look at U.S. initial jobless claims, I think we're all familiar with the fact that they are at levels that no one could have anticipated or has ever seen before. But what this chart shows in the orange line, that's basically the weekly jobless claims in the midst of the financial crisis. So this was back in 2010, although you could go to most of the years of the crisis and it was similar. And the blue line is what we've seen so far this year. And the thing that is just striking about this to me is we think about the financial crisis and how worse that was from the norm that we've been experiencing in this current year. If you look at those lines, you know, based on the scale, they're actually not that far apart relative to the impact of what's been going on over the past few weeks, where, you know, the differences before were maybe a couple 100,000 jobless claims a week. Now we've gone upwards of, you know, 5 to 7 million jobless claims, again, just in the past few weeks. So to me, when you sort of see it in this perspective and you see it in this light, it really, again, emphasizes the dramatic nature of what we've been going through. Yeah, in terms of, from an industry perspective, kind of what we've seen in terms of the impact, at first glance, a lot of this might be what you expect, especially from a leisure and hospitality standpoint, which has been impacted the most. So this is showing the difference in jobs by industry from February versus March. And as you would expect, sort of leisure and hospitality has been the biggest drop, obviously, with all travel essentially coming to a halt. It is interesting, again, to look at the scale between leisure and hospitality and the other categories, just to put into perspective the dramatic nature of what's happened to that industry versus many of the others. It's just so much more significant in terms of the declines for that sector versus any other, that it really just emphasizes sort of that level of pain that industry is feeling. The other piece is, you know, I think it's easy to sort of have the reflexive perspective that essential industries are doing fine when you think about things like healthcare or retail. But I think it's always important to unpack those industries into a couple of different categories as well, because as you can see in the aggregate, you know, healthcare, retail, both of those are down overall. And if you take healthcare, well, obviously the need for you know, ER clinicians and doctors and nurses has been up significantly. There's obviously that's more than offset by the fact that, you know, doctors' offices, dentists, et cetera, all those private practices have been shuttered. So it's important to sort of realize that there's multiple forces being expressed against a lot of these industries. Same thing with retail. Obviously, traditional retail had been challenged a lot going into the crisis in many subsectors of retail. And what you're seeing here is for every grocery store or Walmart or Target that's seeing continued demand, you're having lots of other retailers, non-essential retailers, who obviously have had to shut their doors, and as a byproduct of that, you know, reduce their staffs. It's pretty telling for anybody who's you know, been to a mall to visit either, you know, Walmart or Target, whatever. There's usually, you see a lot of traffic and a lot of cars outside that essential service, but when you look at the rest of the mall, it's pretty empty.
Hey, Scott.
Yep.
The government line obviously is also interesting, and I was curious if you have a sense of whether that's an early government, if that's tied to the, you know, government intervention, the programs around their COVID response, or if it's simply a pre-COVID number that was tied to other government initiative. Any comment there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I can't tie the aggregate now what was happening before or after COVID, but obviously with the level of government support, that has necessitated an increase in the need of basically government personnel to help administer a lot of those programs. So you think of all, just as an example, all the hotlines that have been established to answer questions and concerns related to COVID or things of that nature. All of those things are new initiatives which required incremental staff as a means to set up. So,
Thanks, Scott.
great. All right, probably kind of more interesting is kind of what we've been seeing here at Monster, and like the overall market, we have seen job ads down overall, but as you might expect, we have seen demand remain strong for many of those roles associated with essential businesses. So you see here just a few snapshots from listings for registered nurses or critical care nurses, obviously aligned to the increased demand for hospitals and emergency room care. You also see increased demand for drivers, so motor vehicle operators, and elements of retail, so stockroom warehouse workers. That's an interesting one in particular, which is sort of that gray line at the top. That's a bit volatile. That's the one which is blending together a couple of the subsegments of retail that I alluded to earlier, where you do have certain elements of retail which are just exploding in terms of demand. Those are obviously aligned with essential businesses like grocery, and then the counter effect of those which have had to shut their doors based on the fact that they aren't an essential business, and that sort of push-pull dynamic that you've seen. But what we're seeing just in our data is sort of very consistent with what you would expect given the focus on essential businesses. In terms of, I think going into this, there might have been the expectation, and there certainly was from my perspective, the hypothesis that with this many people out of work, we would have seen a dramatic and sustained increase in the level of candidate activity. And actually that hasn't turned out to be the case. So what you see here is just one data point, which is around, or one metric, which is around kind of new resumes on the Monster platform. And what you see is as the pandemic started, you did start to see a certain level of increase, but that has dissipated over the past couple of weeks. So it's basically just been, a noise, not inconsistent with typical kind of week to week volume changes that we've seen. This has also played out on a macro level more broadly. So when we look at data in terms of job searches from Google, they're actually dramatically down from where they were pre-COVID as it relates to job searches. And there's a few reasons which are driving it. Certainly, those people who may have potentially been looking for a job who haven't been impacted by either layoffs or furloughs, a lot of those individuals have now sort of retrenched from their job search and are actually now holding on more tightly to the jobs that they currently have. So less of sort of employed new entrants into the job seeking market. I think the other piece is, with a lot of those that have been furloughed, to a certain degree, there's still some sort of hope and expectation that their jobs will come back. So that is another influencer on why they may not be more broadly participating in job searching activity. Obviously, many folks are still, even those who have lost their jobs, they're getting unemployment benefits, and they're just sort of at the starting amount of those or the duration is just starting. So they may be sort of subsisting on that for now before they re-enter the job market. And then I think the last is just the general feeling with the uncertainty and the level of job loss that has taken place, that even if they are, going back in and searching for jobs, I don't think they're terribly optimistic around their ability to secure a job, in the immediate term. So I think the confluence of all those factors are likely what's driving this sort of at least short-term impact, that we're not seeing the dramatic uptake in candidate activity that you might expect given the situation.
Hey, Scott, I know we're going to, in a moment, get into some of the keywords that are being entered into the job searches that we are seeing on the site, which I think is interesting. But there was a specific question that came in from one of our attendees. And again, I encourage everybody to feed us your questions through the Q&A panel. But this question was whether we know if there's any specific types of job seekers that are still posting their resume. For example, engineers, salespeople, accountants, or is it just the essential worker type role, or is it even the essential worker type role? Because I assume so many of them are in demand that they may not need to post their resume. So in any case, are you seeing any specific types of job seekers who are still posting their resume in spite of the market data that you just shared?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of those who are actually posting their resume, I wouldn't say there's a clear trend around it's driving sort of this type of professional to post versus this type of professional to post. It's still sort of a mix. A lot of those, essential, depending on which essential category you're talking about, a lot of those people may not even have resumes to post. Obviously, certainly on the job ad side, it's sort of a similar story. So, just one element there is we're still seeing significant demand on the technology, the software developer side. So that continues to be our number one source of new job ads that are posted. It's sort of down from the peak pre-COVID, but not down nearly to the degree as other categories are.
Okay, and one of our guests asked you to just quickly summarize again the 2 or 3 key reasons that you believe candidates are not more active in the market given the COVID instability.
Yeah, no, that's great. Just to circle back on those, I think there's 3 primary ones. I think one is the fact that those who are currently employed, who may have been thinking about getting into the job market pre-COVID, are now very attached to the job that they currently have, and so aren't necessarily looking to make that move to the same degree they were kind of pre-COVID. They're sort of holding on to the jobs that they have. The second is, with those who have entered the ranks of either furloughed or unemployment, a lot of those are still, they're obviously getting unemployment benefits and other sources of income as well. So that sort of incentive to necessarily automatically jump back into the employment picture hasn't materialized yet. So I think over time that will lessen. And then the third is just the general, I think, lack of optimism that anyone would have given the current situation. So given the levels of uncertainty and just the sheer magnitude of the job losses that have taken place, I think it's just a naturally discouraging factor from anybody sort of wanting to jump back and kind of get into the job search process.
Right. And Scott, we got one other question that was interesting, and they were just asking if there were any hot areas where the desire for certain talent, like digital, is increasing. I think they mean, I believe they mean geographic, but perhaps they meant the titles themselves. That might be a question we need to follow up on in the back end, but anything you want to add?
No, nothing that I can comment on immediately. I haven't seen sort of any sort of clear trend jump out around, this area is vastly outperforming something else, but it's something we probably need to circle back on.
Yeah, agreed. So for the people that are sending in questions, if we can't offer you a direct answer through the Q&A, we will try to follow up post-event after we research our own internal data to come back with a direct answer, and appreciate the questions that are still coming in. Another question that came in was that we're hearing a lot of people are losing their jobs, but we're trying to source resumes and we're still having difficulty finding a strong resource. I think, Scotty, I'll let you add color to this again, but I think you've generally spoken to this, that while we were also expecting to see new resumes continue to grow at a fairly significant pace, given the volume of furloughs and layoffs that are occurring in the market. What we are seeing actually is a dramatic slowing of new resumes being added, which we believe is likely tied to a hesitancy perhaps on people's part to begin the job search in a post-COVID world. I think we'll tie this into the next slide that you're going to share, Scott, because I think it also provides people with some interesting insight.
Yeah. So it is interesting when you actually look at candidate behavior and what are the types of jobs that they are searching for. Again, it's really aligned to what you would expect in terms of the current situation. So we've seen a huge jump in people searching for work from home, obviously healthcare, as you might imagine, things like warehouse workers. My favorite is the one on the bottom, which is food delivery, which was basically zero over the past several weeks, and now has gone up significantly, obviously. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a change in what people are searching for, aligned to the current situation.
Yeah, there was another question, interesting, but I think aligned to this topic in some ways. One of our attendees said that he had noticed in Canada, since the government came out with the student relief program of $1,250 per month for the summer, $5,000 in total, that applications from students at his company had dropped dramatically. And he was asking if we had any thoughts on the student patterns of behavior in terms of the apply side. It's a great question. We do have a site that's part of the Monster family, for those that don't know, called FastWeb, which, in addition to providing students with guidance on scholarships, which is what it's primarily used for, also does have a job board that is powered by Monster that presents internships and short-term jobs. So I would encourage anybody to consider posting for that. I'm not pushing a FastWeb on you, but I just want to throw that out there. And we can certainly look at whether we're seeing applies drop off significantly for those jobs as a trend line. But to Scott's point, I think that what is clear from the search patterns that are continuing is there is a hesitancy to approach a job that might not be readily apparent as something that they could handle with appropriate social distancing in a post-COVID world. So I think it's really important for those that are hiring to take that into account with your job post, to ensure that you are demonstrating an awareness of the post-COVID world as much as you can in a job post, and encouraging them to engage so that perhaps you can further, put their concerns at ease. Because obviously every company is addressing how to support their employees in this in this current crisis and in the post-COVID world. And so whether you are a current employee or a potentially new employee, an employer would need to demonstrate, how they're working to keep their employees safe. And I would just encourage people to address that in any way you can in your job post. Scott, anything you want to add to that?
No, I would agree with everything you said.
Okay. And then there was a question that came in. Sorry, Scott, there's a lot that have come in on these last two slides.
Okay.
That what do we think might happen to small agencies? I'm assuming they mean recruitment firms, recruiting agencies specializing in software development. This attendee, sorry, said, I have found that many of my clients are putting searches on hold right now. I have had my own business for almost a decade, and obviously this person is very concerned, as we all are, in the precipitous change that we're experiencing. Any thoughts there, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only comment I would make is, it's really hard to generalize a lot of these trends and the impacts that they're having, just because they can be so specific to a specific kind of company or a specific area of the country, or a specific need. I mean, I think, as I said, we still see strong demand for software developer jobs just from a job ad posting perspective, but it certainly is a decline from where it was before COVID started, and as a result, I think that decline will be felt differently by different individuals based off of a whole host of different factors. And so again, sort of as I think about sort of the broad-based impacts of COVID, it's sort of hard to look at things in the aggregate because there's going to be a lot of volatility that exists kind of beneath the surface.
Okay, and just two more, Scott, and then we'll move on. So, because I really liked a couple of these questions. One of them was, did we see the same type of pattern in declining new resumes during the economic downturn of 2008, the financial downturn? I believe the answer to that question is generally no. Anything you want to add to that?
So I don't have the data to say was it similar or not, but I would say I think there are there's a lot of differences, I think, in this situation if you were just to compare the numbers. And I think the biggest difference is just the sheer magnitude of what's happened over the past few weeks versus what we saw in the financial crisis, where it was a less dramatic but more kind of consistent period of time, multi-year period of time where we saw that. So, and certainly I think in the financial crisis, you probably saw it in different pockets. So obviously financial services was probably an area where, you probably saw impacts differently from software development, for instance, which likely held up better during that period of time.
And as I said, one more question, then we'll move to the next slide, Scotty. But another great question: do we think that this trend of working from home will be adopted as a new norm by employers in the long run, or is it a short-term or temporary trend?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And as when we in a few slides, when we talk about sort of how we think about the long-term implications of COVID and what we're going to be seeing, I think the level of, call it, elasticity that both consumers and businesses have around the current situation, I think will be interesting to see how it plays out. So I think there's always, I think there's a couple pieces. I think certainly there's a lot of businesses who are hesitant to allow remote work, who have seen, hey, this actually, we've been able to maintain productivity. We see a lot of benefits. We could potentially look to save on real estate costs, et cetera. And I think there's a meaningful proportion of businesses who are sort of saying that now. I think the real question will be when the rubber hits the road and things sort of return to quote unquote normal. Will that still be the position that they hold, or they sort of slowly work back to kind of the position that they have today? I think time will tell.
Right. And just anecdotally, you and I Scott, were a part of a customer advisory board meeting that Monster held with a smaller group of customers. And I thought it was interesting, Scott, that we heard from pretty much every one of them that as they are working to plan what going back to work looks like, in addition to trying to solve that question of, who can work from home and whether or not that trend, if we want to call it that, 'cause it's obviously been such a short period of time, even though it feels like a long one, whether that trend is adoptable. But for those that they feel should come back to work, or even if they want to make it available to everyone, what we have certainly heard a lot of discussion around from these CHROs and heads of and talent acquisition is that that phrase normal is a loose term, right? That going back to work, at least initially, cannot be done in the same way that it was window, that there will need to be some focus by employers put on social distancing or scanners and stuff like that. At least those questions need to be addressed, before an employer finalizes that plan. So, I be curious to see if you want to add anything to that, Scott. But in my mind, it's hard to envision that we go back to normal anytime in the next year or so. It's likely a new normal and an iterative process. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I would sort of caveat my last statement to say that was probably looking out, over the next couple of years in terms of the long term. Will there be sort of this shift in the perspective around remote work? I think you're absolutely right. This idea that it's not going to be a light switch where all of a sudden things immediately get better and we all kind of go back to the same situation that we have experienced. Clearly there was going to be a slow, steady, incremental approach to how businesses start to reopen and how we all start to kind of re-enter at least sort of the physical workforce. And because of that, certainly this idea of remote work and remote collaboration is going to be with us for an extended period of time.
Sorry, I think we could probably go through another slide or two. There are more questions coming in, and I'll continue to jump in if you don't mind, but I'll let you advance a few more slides.
Perfect. So that's been a bit of a perspective around sort of what what we've seen sort of at the point in time. I think then the next question is sort of long term, kind of what does recovery start to look like? And I think we've all started to become familiar with the alphabet soup of what the recovery patterns could look like. Whether it is sort of this V-shaped immediate rebound, a more gradual kind of U-shaped, a potentially longer L-shaped format of recovery, or any letter in between, so W, X, whatever you want to call it. I think with any of these scenarios, first and foremost, I personally don't see it as being a linear shape of recovery. So in any scenario, I think we will see some level of sort of W, where we will see sort of some improvement and then maybe a little bit of a decline and then some improvement as we sort of gradually work to whatever shape things might end up evolving into. I think, generally speaking, I would say the consensus is more around some sort of a U-shaped kind of gradual recovery, where we start to see some kind of green shoots later in 2020, and we really sort of see recovery by the end of 2021, versus sort of this idea that by the end of the year we'll sort of be back to quote unquote normal, or several years down the road we'll still be sort of fighting the current situation. But again, sort of there's obviously a whole host of factors, which I think is more important, around what would drive the shape of the recovery. And I think keeping these sort of factors in mind and informing kind of the thinking around the different scenarios, I think is probably what's most important. So, obviously the timing and the effective transition back from sort of this period of working from home and maintaining some degree of social distancing, the way we're able to sort of reopen businesses. If we do it obviously too quickly, and that negates a lot of the benefit that we've experienced so far will put us obviously in a longer recovery path. Similarly, if there are secondary waves of infection, which certainly could be tied to the last bullet around the timing of any sort of kind of vaccine or effective therapeutic treatment, obviously will influence the level and timing of the rebound. To me, I think some of the more interesting ones to consider, the first sort of I alluded to earlier, which is around this sort of the elasticity of consumer behavior. This idea that if we were able to open things fully tomorrow and we all had the ability to travel wherever we want or go into our businesses, how quickly would consumer behavior rebound? Is it the case where, relatively quickly after kind of reopening, people will feel comfortable about going out to restaurants, going to movie theaters, getting on airplanes? Or is that going to be a sort of sustained period of reduced demand and lead to sort of a new normal? I think that's one of the key questions that we'll have to see how it actually plays out. And the other one is sort of, I think about is sort of just the social pressure to reopen sooner. So we've seen, a lot of protests in certain areas of the country to reopen the economy. A lot of the several states are obviously in the beginning stages of starting to reopen. To a certain degree, some of that I think is driven by social pressure. So as we all sort of get the novelty of the current situation wears off, and we really start to feel the pressure of wanting to return, does that drive different decision making from a political perspective based on sort of public opinion? So I think all these factors will really work together to determine what the shape of that and timing of that recovery looks like.
Mm-hmm. Scott, one question that came in somewhat specific to this slide is obviously what you're looking at in terms of recovery is a more broad stroke view of potential outcomes in the global economy. The question was specific to the talent acquisition industry. Any thoughts on how we might see this global impact play out for TA professionals in light of COVID?
Yeah, so here, I guess my perspective would be, again, part of it I think is sort of tied to the pace of the recovery, but I would imagine from a talent acquisition perspective, given probably the volatility that will likely exist as we sort of work our way out of the current situation, there may be less demand for immediately going back to hiring, a whole bunch of full-time employees to sort of fill the roles that are needed, versus more flexible types of roles, whether it be contingent workers, whether it be more kind of project-based workers, et cetera. I would imagine that we'll see demand pick up for those types of roles faster than sort of the traditional full-time hire. So that's sort of how I would expect things to play out.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is a question we'll need to follow up on, but I just want to call it out. They asked if we're seeing any type of trend for employers posting or hiring temporary or part-time employees versus full-time as a way to offset the volatility that they're dealing with in the economy and perhaps in their own business. Any thoughts on that, Scott, from what you've read?
So I mean, clearly there's an increased demand for certain elements of gig-oriented work or hourly types of jobs, especially if you think of retail, grocery retail, et cetera. In term, I think the other piece to that is, are we seeing more? Hey, it could be a full-time job, but it's only for a set period of time. That I would have to follow up on to see if there's any more information there.
Thanks, Scott.
So regardless of what recovery actually ends up looking like, it's clear that there's going to be change for many of the industries that are out there, regardless of what things look like. Just to sort of point out a few, I think retail, I think has been forever changed by what's been going on really, I think in two dimensions. I think one is that, there was always a little bit of the have and have nots in retail lately, but I think what we've seen is a broader consumer acceptance of different business models than they had in the past, especially when we think about things like online delivery. We obviously, most of us have obviously been doing that a long time for with Amazon for a lot of products that we buy. I think there has been a increased demand for us to try out and accept things like online delivery for grocery or curbside pickup. So a lot of these business models and ways of working have changed in a way that I think will impact the broader retail landscape more broadly. Those who haven't invested in those types of sort of omni-media ways of fulfillment will obviously be, I think, be impacted to an even greater degree than they might have had they had adopted it. I think this will be sort of be the new normal of consumer behavior. Higher education and education really more broadly, when you think about all the distance learning that's taken place and sort of the widespread adoption of technology to facilitate distance learning, to the degree that that plays out as being effective, that could have dramatic implications on sort of the traditional educational, especially higher educational model. And then, one of my favorites is sort of what's going to happen with the movie business. So I worked in the movie business in a prior life, and the linkage between the movie studios and the movie theaters was incredibly tight. But these days, with all the movie theaters shut, a lot of the movie studios have gone direct to consumer with their new releases in particular. I think I just saw a stat. I think that for those with young kids who have seen the new Trolls movie, it's actually grossed more through this direct to channel or direct to consumer model than it would have if it were in the theaters, or at least that's what the projections were. And so it calls into question, will the traditional sort of distribution model of entertainment change and be much more of a direct to consumer model than we've seen in the past? So just to kind of a few examples of how the implications of the current situation may carry them through.
Thanks, Scott. I now I know why you look familiar when we met. I didn't realize I had seen you in. And as far as that Trolls movie is concerned, I had the pleasure of watching it, and it definitely is making more than it deserves. For you parents out there, sorry to say.
Yeah, whatever.
All right. Right. Just one other more serious point here. There are many schools who have brought in students from overseas, and this person was speculating whether that will be greatly impacted too, especially if these students are paying full fare. I think this is a great question. I know, Scott, you haven't collected research on this, but we can just giving a shout to the attendee that we can follow up on that one in the back end after discussing it with our Fast Web team. They're more focused on the student population and what's happening there.
That's good. All right. And then, kind of more broadly, COVID-19 provides, an interesting lens to view kind of organizational approaches and configurations more broadly. So there was the question around remote work and sort of to what degree is that going to become the new normal, or is it sort of more of a short-term reaction to the current situation? I think you can sort of extend that lens to a lot of the other elements of how organizations are structured and operate, whether it be the traditional, org structure. There's sort of been a lot of movement and sort of hype around moving to more of an agile project-based, less sort of rigid bureaucratic traditional org structures in the past. Does sort of COVID sort of accelerate that path down that direction? And kind of with that, does that sort of lead to a different makeup around how we think of the workforce? Does it transition from one which is more full-time employees to one which is more project-based or contingent oriented? On the other side, there's a lot of discussion that actually this current crisis has made employers, appreciate their employees and want to take care of their employees at a larger degree. And actually, when we come out of this, we may see an increase in that sort of full-time model, and the level of benefits and protection that we offer from a corporate perspective to those employees may increase. So, again, there's sort of a lot of different potential paths, and it will obviously be different for different companies. I would say if there is a common thread, I think it does provide a bit of an accelerant for companies to move a little bit faster down the path that they were going towards anyway. So if they were sort of progressing down a path of more remote work, I think this provides the accelerant to have them shift down that path more quickly. If they were thinking of sort of changing their sort of org structure or org design, I think this provides that sort of accelerant to do that as well. So again, not necessarily going to be clear-cut, consistent answers for every company, but this is sort of just a way of thinking about the spectrum of options and possibilities that do exist.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Appreciate all the effort you put to gathering this research, and I know we get quite a few other questions from our audience. We can't address them all today in the live format, but as I mentioned, we're taking careful note of all the questions, and we'll be coming back to you. We also will have a little bit more time, I hope, in a few minutes to take a few more questions. I did want to jump ahead to just providing everyone attending this event with some insights into what Monster is doing to try to assist our partners and our customers during this crisis. If you could jump to the next slide, Scott. So one of the things that is really important to us here at Monster is to live our values. We all know that the healthcare industry is under a tremendous strain right now. The resources to support the need in this crisis are extremely difficult to find. And we want to help make that possible. So we are right now offering free postings that are related to these essential healthcare worker categories and addressing the needs for COVID-19. You can access those free postings either through our e-com platform, our self-service e-com platform, or by communicating with your sales rep at Monster. If you have a need for essential workers, it's really a perfect example of the way we're living our values, and we're just trying to do the right thing here, folks, and finding creative ways to help during a real time of need. Because we've gotten a very strong reaction to this offer, because it has been out for quite some time. Can you jump to the next slide, Scott? We've in fact seen that about 699 US-based companies have taken advantage of this offer, and they've posted about 1.7 thousand jobs already in the US specifically. I want to add, although we are doing some of this globally as well in certain countries. So based on this, we made the decision to expand our focus. Next slide, please, Scott. So we are offering for the last few weeks, but because of the obvious need that really does tie into other critical categories, we are now offering those same social worker free posts for warehouse and logistics, shipping and delivery services, food supply chain, and crisis response. We're limiting the number of posts to 10 per employer. Obviously, we are working to provide support for small companies, first and foremost, who we all know were hardest hit by this crisis. And so that's why we're focusing on limiting the number of jobs. We're obviously fully aware that those companies really are in more difficult times, and we're working to find additional ways to provide value to them. If I could jump to the next slide, Scott. On the candidate side, we are also taking a regular pulse of the content that we are rolling out across all of our channels. I would encourage everyone, whether you are a candidate or an employer, to seek out the material that we are offering candidates, because as I said earlier, I really do believe that informing your own outreach through the concerns that the candidates have is the best way to help you drive the applies that you need at this moment. Right? Whether it's to demonstrate that, in fact, your company is taking the appropriate precautions to enable a new hire to work in a safe environment, or whether they will be able to work from home, or whatever the particular concerns candidates might have. We're working to address those concerns, as we've gotten a lot of inquiries from candidates, as you can imagine, by creating content that is dedicated to COVID-related career advice. So we encourage you to come to Monster, read up on that to help inform how you're shaping your own response and your own engagement with candidates, okay? We've sent emails to 5 million subscribers with a regular content feed on the pandemic. Through Instagram, we're posting poll results pretty consistently, and Monster advice on how to work through the pandemic. And we have a new grad experience because I know some of you have questions around new grads, where we are working to offer specifically into your own
Hey, Bob, you're a little garbled right now.
search and your own engagement strategies. Sorry, next slide. Oh, that's not good. That's the problem of everybody being on online. I'll do something now where I stop my video.
Perfect.
And hope that it might improve the audio quality. Is that a little better, Meg?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. Did you miss what I had shared on this slide, or should I repeat it?
Would you mind running through it again?
No, I wouldn't. I'll be quick. As I said, our candidate support is really important to us at Monster. As you can imagine, we've gotten a lot of interest from candidates on how they should go about their career in this climate. So we have created a wealth of content dedicated to COVID-related advice. We have a career advice section on the Monster site, which, as I said, I would encourage everyone to review, because whether you are a candidate yourself or an employer who is trying to appeal to candidates in this COVID climate, you could learn a lot about the insights that we've shared with candidates to help you shape your own engagement. We've also got emails going out to 5 million subscribers, Instagram posts featuring polls on a regular basis, and a new graduate experience where we're offering advice to those graduates on how to go about finding their first job in a COVID-driven world. Hopefully that came through loud and clear, guys. Yes, I see Scott shaking yes. Okay, that's good. So Scott, could you jump to that next slide, please? Thank you. So another question that had come up is, what do we think about video, and whether video will become a standard format in the talent acquisition lifecycle? I think there's no question that video is important to us here at Monster, and that we believe it is going to be an important part of the process moving forward. I saw that my internet, I got a warning about internet stability again. Are you guys able to hear me, Scott? Just nod your head if yes. I'm good. Okay, thank you, sir. So last year we launched Monster Studios to support employers in establishing their brand value. I want to emphasize that Monster Studios has always been free and remains free. I would encourage everybody to utilize this incredibly valuable platform. If you are posting a job on Monster, Monster Studios is free with that job posting. It enables you to establish your employer brand value. And there's never been a more important time in this environment to establish a direct connection with candidates that, I'm sorry, just can't be done through an antiquated job post. So if you are willing to get in front of a video, much like Scott and I are doing today, I think that candidates would welcome any opportunity they could have to engage with employers in more direct ways. And a video tool like Monster Studio is an incredibly useful one. And again, it's free for anyone that's posting a job on Monster. For those on the heels of this, I should say, we are also offering today free candidate video interviewing services. It has been rolled out to our self-service customers. In parallel with this, we're looking at a separate partnership for enterprise and majors customers, or at least a referral opportunity. We've done a thorough investigation of vendors in that market, and we're going to look to see if we can provide our customers with insights. I will say this, again, referring back to the customer advisory board meeting that we held just a couple of weeks ago. We are seeing, qualitatively speaking, that our customers are, of course, utilizing video to weather the storm. Whether that is going to be a significantly growing trend on the back end or not is yet to be seen. But at Monster, we really believe in the value of video as a way to create strong connection and transparency throughout the talent acquisition lifecycle. So I would encourage everybody to take advantage of Monster Studio. If you are a small business and working through our self-service channel, I would encourage you to utilize Spark Hire, and I look forward to empowering our sales team with a free referral to a potential video service for the larger companies that we support during this pandemic. All right, I'm just pausing there to see if any questions came in on video that I can speak to. So on that, I don't see anything jumping out at me. So on that, I'm just going to throw it back out to the community for, I know we're right at the hour. I want to see if there's another question or two we can answer, and then promise that we'll come back to the additional questions that were surfaced post-event. So Scott, I'm just reviewing those questions for a minute to see if there's one last one we can close it up on. Any thoughts on how our employers might consider more candidates that are looking to transition into new careers, perhaps, since they're not able to find jobs in their that might have been readily apparent just a few weeks ago, Scott, in their, based on their own experience and in their own field. Any thoughts on how? I think the question is more like how employers might connect to those candidates that are looking to transition.
I mean, to me, I think, leveraging technology, things like video, I think is certainly one, I think, emerging way to do that. And I mean, to me, I think it's more, attitudinally around, how that engagement occurs and the level of empathy that needs to happen as it means to kind of make those connections, especially just given the time that we're in.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Again, I want to thank everybody for dialing in. We did have a number of questions, but we're going to wrap it up right now. We will work to come back to individuals with the answers to your questions on the back end. Thank you all for your partnership. Thanks everybody for dialing in for this webinar, and we appreciate your business and we appreciate your partnership, and we look forward to finding new ways to support you during this crisis. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, Meg.